like, bro, yeah, she got a kid. Look at his back. Oh my god.
What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another reaction. Today we're going to be reacting to the war in Ukraine could have global consequences. Caspian Report. Love this channel. Very in-depth, intrinsic info, you know, able to like necessarily give us the info we need to see. Yeah, this whole Ukraine thing is crazy, man. It's crazy. And they're seeing troops posting TikToks and these videos. It's just crazy to see a modern war of this scale and you're able to necessarily witness it just through the lens of technology that we have now. It's just like everything is just, I don't know, it's almost kind of hard, like, understanding the situation and understanding like all the, like everything that these people are going through is serious, but it's kind of hard to take it serious when you got dudes making all these memes and TikToks about it. You know, actual troops in the military playing Chief Keef, Finito, talking about we're ready, we're in our preload screen. Preload? What are you talking about? You know, you can actually, you can go to an embassy right now in your country. If you have a Ukrainian embassy in your country right now, you can go there and sign up to join the Ukrainians in the fight. So all you dudes, all you keyboard warriors and people who think they can really be about it, why don't you go join them and go see what it's like? From last I've seen, the Ukrainian president have been making like a last final speech in his bunker somewhere, and he's not even able to be in contact with his family because he's like on a Russian hit list and stuff like that. Like they have eyes set on him to take him out. Yeah, but who knows? Now, if you're doing the reactions, hit that like button, subscribe, and shares over to 10K. We're gonna hop right into this video.
The unthinkable has happened. Hostilities have broken out between Ukraine and Russia, and the stakes are global. The Russian invasion is Europe's biggest war since the 1940s, and the first toppling since then of a democratically elected government by a foreign invader. An assessment by US intelligence estimates that a full-blown conflict, prolonged over a lengthy period of time and covering all of Ukrainian territory, could lead to as many as 50,000 civilian casualties. Refugees, possibly in the millions, would move in multiple directions. Europe would start arming itself to the teeth, China would see an opening to take over Taiwan by force, and Iran would shift the nuclear talks in its favor. Likewise, prolonged conflict in Ukraine would affect global markets, like energy prices, raw materials, commodities, etc. Russia and Ukraine account for a remarkable 29% of the worldwide supply of wheat. Prolonged conflict in this breadbasket would have ripple effects across the world. So, now that the Kremlin has let slip the dogs of war, let's quantify the military, economic, and political consequences.
Do they necessarily like control any land? Like I know they have the Donbass region where like they have the separatist movements and they like control that region.
Today's video is sponsored by Masterworks.
Right now,
we chose to work with Masterworks in this video because unlike most investment platforms, Masterworks has nothing to do with the stock market, real estate, or cryptocurrency.
Videos always look beautiful.
Masterworks is all about fine art. Here's the rundown. Contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 total return by 164% from 1995 to 2021. Meanwhile, Deloitte projects the total wealth held in art, which is estimated to be worth $1.7 trillion, to grow by $900 billion by 2026.
Jesus.
Now, I'm not a billionaire who can purchase artwork at will, but using Masterworks, I can own a slice of Banksy, arguably the most controversial street artist in the world. Masterworks allows retail investors like myself to invest in fine art, an asset class previously only available to the 1%. Use the link in the description to gain priority access. Doing so really supports our channel, so check it out. Just be careful in everything related to investing. Nothing is risk-free. War is a racket. It begins when governments believe the price of hostility is affordable. Russia's supreme objective in Ukraine is to disconnect the country from the West, a goal that could take many forms, like regime change, federalization, partitioning, or even a negotiated surrender. Should Russia win and gain control over Ukraine, and the jury is still out on that, but should it win and stabilize the country on a large scale, the geopolitical calculus would change completely. It wouldn't be like it was before. Europe would have to rethink its security arrangements. New doctrines would be crafted that restrict collective security to the core members of the EU and NATO. Anyone caught outside the club would be on their own. Finland and Sweden would have authentic reasons to join NATO, and public opinions may yet steer them into the arms of NATO. But aside these two nations, both the EU and NATO would likely halt their expansion programs for new members. Europe would look to bolster the defense of its members, but not beyond. Meanwhile, Russian sway over Ukraine, and by extension Belarus, would be seen by the neighborhood as a security hazard. A vast front line of insecurity, call it the new Iron Curtain, would extend from Estonia to Poland to Romania to Turkey. This image by flight radar shows that frontier in the making. This is what it looks like when the global order undergoes change. Of course, Europe would reject the new Russian-backed government in Kiev, but it would be a situation reminiscing Belarus. The Europeans wouldn't know what to do about a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. Yet ironically, by attacking Ukraine, Russia has gifted NATO a new means of existence. The United States will play an indispensable role in that transition, so much so that Washington may yet pivot to Europe again. Strengthening NATO would be the means to provide security reassurances to Europe and deter Russia from encroachment. NATO would return to its roots. No more democracy building or nation building, but a straightforward military alliance that it was meant to be. However, while Washington and Moscow come to see each other as bitter enemies, hostilities can only be taken to a certain threshold. As two formidable nuclear powers, the Kremlin and the White House would have to keep their outrage in check. So, rather than a kinetic exchange, a permanent economic war of attrition would be the most defining consequence. Sanctions would harm Russia, but the Kremlin could survive the immediate economic fallout. The Russian central bank has about $643 billion in reserves, enough to withstand the sanctions thrown at Russia. That said, about 40% of the reserves are held in euros and 5% in British pound. These quantities can still be targeted by sanctions. That's almost half the Russian reserves. So sanctions on the central bank would diminish Russia's strength to stave off economic collapse. In the long run, however, China could serve as an economic substitute for the West. Russia's trade with the European Union accounted for nearly $220 billion in 2021, while bilateral trade with China accounted for $146 billion. But even though the European market is roughly 1.5 times the size of Russian-Chinese trade, the latter has grown substantially in recent years. For comparison, while in 2003, trade with China made up $16 billion, by 2021, it had grown to $146 billion. If bilateral trade continues at a pace, China could replace the West as an economic substitute. But whether the Russian reserves have enough funding to bridge the gap depends on the severity of the sanctions. Now, Europe, at tremendous cost to itself, could decide to reduce energy imports from Russia, which would cut deep into the Russian skin. Energy revenues account for almost 40% of the Russian budget revenues. So, this is income that wouldn't be readily replaceable. Increasing natural gas exports to China is an option, but that would require constructing and expanding infrastructure from the Siberian deposits to the Chinese heartland. Building such a vast network of pipelines would cost tens of billions of dollars. Moreover, it wouldn't be as profitable as the European market, since the Chinese wouldn't be paying premium price as the Europeans do. Beyond trade and energy, the Americans and the Europeans could introduce the mother of all sanctions, cutting off Russia from the SWIFT payment system. Some banks have already been cut, but not all. There are some EU member states that want to keep loopholes in place while claiming credit for standing up to Russia. For context, SWIFT is a global transfer system used by banks and financial institutions to send and receive money transfer instructions. It's a system that's quick, accurate, and secure. There are more than 11,000 SWIFT member institutions that make more than 35 million daily transactions. All of this, the entire SWIFT network is regulated by the power of the dollar. Using SWIFT for political...
Yeah, man, I heard that type of sanction they were talking about necessarily removing Russia from like the financial, global economy and stuff like that, regulating them to the ruble. Because apparently there's more ruble located outside of Russia than there actually are inside of Russia. And not being able to necessarily trade your resources for any other currency can definitely have a major effect on them. It can definitely hinder their ability to, uphold their military power. They're number 2 spot in the world right now, but that's more necessarily just because of their nuclear capability than anything, And we're seeing that now, how on paper these places seem like the most powerful armies ever, but whenever you see them in work, I mean, Ukrainians are holding them off pretty well. I'm not saying they're going to be able to do that indefinitely, most likely not. I mean, the firepower that the Russians have is just completely overwhelming. Definitely have a much bigger air force than them. Yeah, bro. But it's just crazy to see where it can go. I've been seeing things like, and you don't know what's propaganda, what's not, because a lot of this stuff from the West is just fear-mongering as well. But apparently Putin talking about maneuvering his nuclear weapons on ready. Like they're ready to go off. Saying I would just hate to have to fucking wake up one day and I gotta get that nuclear alert. Like, yeah, 15 minutes to live. Like, oh great. Over Ukraine? Really? Like, yeah, damn, man. But a mouse built a mousetrap? Humans built nukes.
Means could undermine its reliability and motivate other nations to create alternatives. China has its own international payment system in place. Now Russia could integrate into that alternative, but it wouldn't be the same. SWIFT sanctions without loopholes would suffocate businesses in Russia. In response to such drastic measures, Russia could raise its hybrid war in Europe. Cyber attacks and political lobbying could become the norm. Much of this is already happening, but a sustained conflict in Ukraine would ante up the stakes. Moscow would indirectly and directly encourage pro-Russian candidates or political movements. By doing so, by playing into the self-interest of nations, Russia would try to get one or more European states to back away from the economic war of attrition and thereby undermine consensus in Europe. For instance, a prolonged war in Ukraine could result in millions of refugees moving in multiple directions. Russia could exploit that crisis by worsening the debate on refugee policy and by encouraging populist movements across the continent. This is just one of the many narratives we could see play out over the years.
Do you remember how, during the previous session, he was walking out of the chamber, trying to call someone, not knowing what was going on? How we can trust you? How we can trust your assurance? You have no idea what is on the mind of your president. Your words have less value than a hole in the New York pretzel.
Elsewhere in the world, a prolonged conflict in Ukraine would have geopolitical ripple effects. Seeing Russia defy the West could encourage China in its aims to subjugate Taiwan. China and Taiwan have been bracing for hostilities for decades, but recently things have entered a more dangerous phase. The one country, two systems principle has failed. Beijing is out of diplomatic options, and US military officials believe China could invade Taiwan by 2027. America is already distracted at home with various domestic topics polarizing its political landscape, but an American pivot to Europe would further split Washington's resources. China would have a real opening to take over Taiwan, and it's unlikely that Beijing would miss out on that opportunity. Meanwhile, in the Korean peninsula, Pyongyang's hand would strengthen at the negotiations. Should Russia shift from its current handbrake invasion to a full-scale invasion, that is to say, should it start applying the full brunt of its force, the ensuing artillery barrage would be unlike anything seen in recent memory. It would paint a vivid picture of what a similar North Korean barrage on South Korea would look like. That notion, as morbid as it sounds, would shift the narrative, possibly even undermining South Korean and Japanese interests. The thing is, sometimes the idea of war can be as harmful as war itself, and a lengthy war in Ukraine would reverberate hostilities in all disputed territories. At the same time, in Iran, the nuclear talks could collapse under its own weight. Russian diplomats play a surprisingly constructive role in the negotiations
Black
with
United
Iran,
States president in the Middle East,
encouraging their
encourage
Iranian
them to expand
counterparts
in,
to partake in the talks. Should Russia have a change of heart, it could pursue the
maybe
opposite
Saudi Arabia
and
some shit.
take on a disruptive attitude in the negotiations. Iran would be more confident and look to leverage its position, which would at the very least stall the negotiations if not collapse it altogether. The outcome of this would be far-reaching, especially for Israel. Prolonged conflict in Ukraine would also affect global prices of commodities, energy, raw materials, food crops, and so on. Oil is already spiking, but a lengthy conflict involving Russia would send prices upwards. Dutch-based analysts from the Rabobank believe that crude oil prices could jump from the current $90 a barrel to anywhere between $125 and $175 a barrel, depending on the severity of the sanctions. The same massive surge would also be seen in natural gas prices, where Europe is especially vulnerable. About 35% of Europe's natural gas comes from Russia, so things could fall apart really fast. A domino effect could push across financial markets. Another important sector is raw materials. Russia is a major producer of copper, aluminium, nickel, platinum, palladium, etc. Some of these raw materials are used in chip making, so expect even more delays in the semiconductor industry. Meanwhile, a long war in the breadbasket of Europe would endanger the food security of nations across the globe. Wheat exports from Russia and Ukraine combined account for a staggering 29% of the global supply. At a time when food prices are already rising due to supply chain disruptions, a prolonged war in Ukraine would skyrocket prices. In some countries, food security would come under severe risk. All in all, the global ramifications of a sustained conflict in Ukraine are extensive. Sometimes, without much reflection, governments go blindly on their way, creating unintended consequences that push nations ceaselessly through the years.
Yeah, that's fucking wild. You even tend to necessarily think about all these things. Like, we're so connected globally that just the smallest type of warfare and like these type of wars have a wide variety of effects on everybody. You know, we're so used to everything just being in a comedy, being just an accommodation and such numbers that, you know, we expect it to always be there all the time. You got things like this that disrupt places, like he said, like Russia and Ukraine that produce a lot of the wheat for other countries around the world that trade their resources for that food. I mean, that can be a big thing, you know? Yeah, man. We're going to see where this goes. Hopefully it doesn't turn into anything necessarily too major or too bad. I've seen videos of Russian troops particularly attacking civilians, things like that, even though Putin has said he's not going to do that. You know, so as long as it drags on, more people are going to die. So I can just hope that this ends soon and that the people of Ukraine can fight on and continue to have that bravery that they've shown to the rest of the world. We're with you, we see you. But yeah, if you enjoyed this reaction, hit that like button, subscribe, and share. Make sure you check out Caspian Report now as well, man. He got a lot of great videos. There's a lot of things that's going in, insightful topics. if you're really into like that geopolitical maps and stuff, check out this channel. I'm that type of guy, you know. But yeah, hit that like button, subscribe, and share. We'll see you next time. Peace.
Da 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 da.